Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point today.
Oh, this will be good.
It's all about how those tiny things we barely notice can spark massive changes.
Like those huge trends that kind of come out of nowhere.
Exactly. And even things like bank robberies.
Really? Bank robbery?
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay, I'm hooked already.
Well, Gladwell starts with this crazy story about bank robberies in 1980s Los Angeles.
Oh, the 80s.
The city was like bank robbery central.
Wild times.
But there was a method to the madness.
So it wasn't just random chaos.
Not at all. Gladwell uses this idea of super spreaders to explain it.
Super spreaders, huh? Like with a virus or something.
Exactly. Like how one person with the flu can infect an entire office.
Okay, I get it. So who were the bank robbery super spreaders?
These two guys, Casper and Sea Dog, they weren't actually robbing the banks themselves.
So what were they doing?
They were the masterminds, inciting and training a whole network of teenagers to do it for them.
Wow, like a bank robbery blueprint.
Exactly. They basically turned individual crime into a social contagion.
That's insane. So it's like they lit the match and then boom, a whole waves of copycats.
Right. And Gladwell ties this to something he calls small area variation. Think about how bank robberies were concentrated in LA.
Okay.
But healthcare practices can also vary wildly from region to region.
Oh, I've heard about that. Like certain procedures are way more common in some places than others.
It's kind of unsettling, right? Where you live can influence the kind of medical treatment you receive.
For sure. It's like medical trends are influenced by a community's, like, personality.
That's a great way to put it.
And you know what else is weird? Vaccine skepticism. Gladwell looks at data from California elementary schools, and vaccination rates are almost perfect everywhere, except in Waldorf schools.
Waldorf schools, those are the ones that focus on creativity and hands-on learning, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You'd think it's just that they attract parents who are already hesitant about vaccines, right?
Yeah, right.
Yes. But Gladwell found that the longer families were part of the Waldorf community, the more likely they were to adopt anti-vaccine beliefs.
Whoa, so it's like the community itself is contagious.
It's a powerful example of how community influences our beliefs and actions.
It's pretty wild when you think about it.
Now, ready for another wild story?
Hit me with it.
Gladwell takes us to Miami.
Huh.
This guy, Philippus Formus, seemingly upstanding businessman, gets caught in this massive Medicare fraud scheme.
Oh, wow.
Gladwell uses this to introduce this idea of overstories, those unspoken rules that kind of shape a community's culture.
Overstory.
Yeah, and he argues that Miami had this specific overstory that basically made it a breeding ground for this kind of fraud.
So what made Miami's overstory so unique?
It all started in the 80s with all that drug money flooding the city.
Ah, the 80s again.
Right. Alongside that cash came the rise of shell companies and this whole culture of exploiting loopholes.
So like opportunity meets a relaxed attitude toward rules.
Exactly. It was so easy to set up fake healthcare businesses, recruit patients, and basically milk the system,
It's almost like Miami's overstory was a virus itself.
infecting people with this get-rich-quick mentality.
Right. And it ties back to that Waldorf effect we talked about, how communities influence our actions.
Absolutely. Okay, now brace yourself, because Gladwell takes us to this picture-perfect town called Poplar Grove.
Poplar Grove. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Top-ranked schools, close-knit community, but a shockingly high suicide rate.
Wait, what? How do those two things even go together?
That's exactly what Gladwell wants us to think about. He argues that Poplar Grove's strengths, its focus on achievement and conformity, actually created a dangerous vulnerability.
Interesting.
He compares it to the genetic bottleneck of cheetahs.
Cheetahs. Wait, how do cheetahs fit into this?
They suffer from a lack of genetic diversity, which makes them more vulnerable to diseases. I see.
yeah.
Gladwell says it's similar in Poplar Grove. The pressure to conform was so intense it created a kind of cultural bottleneck, no room for individuality.
So you're saying that lack of diversity, whether it's genes or culture, can make a community fragile.
Right. Kids who didn't fit the ideal mold had nowhere to turn.
And that lack of diversity contributed to the suicides.
It's a heavy thought, you know? It makes you wonder if we could think of diversity as like a social immune system.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It protects communities from these kinds of tragedies.
Now, all the tipping point examples we've talked about so far seem kind of accidental.
Right, like these communities just stumbled into these situations.
But in the next part of the book, Gladwell shifts gears and looks at intentionally engineering tipping points, both for good and bad.
Oh, now we're getting into some ethically tricky territory.
For sure.
I'm ready for it. Where does he start?
With this concept called the magic third.
The magic third. Tell me more.
It's based on research by a sociologist, Rosabeth Cantor. She studied gender dynamics in corporations.
Interesting.
She found that when women reached a certain critical mass, about 1/3 of the group,
Okay.
the whole dynamic changed dramatically.
So it's not just about having a few token women in the room.
Nope, not at all. It's about hitting that tipping point where their voices can't be ignored.
I like that.
And then Gladwell brings in the work of Damon Centola, who took this even further.
What did Centola study?
He designed experiments to see how many dissenters you need to disrupt a majority opinion.
Okay, I'm curious now.
What he found was pretty amazing, actually.
What was it?
It only takes a surprisingly small percentage, like around 25%, to totally shift a group's consensus.
Wow, really?
Think about what that means for, creating social change.
My mind is officially blown. So if we can find these tipping points, could we actually intentionally engineer positive change?
That's the question, isn't it? And Gladwell explores that with some really thought-provoking examples.
Okay, now I'm really on the edge of my seat.
Some are positive, some are, well, let's just say ethically questionable.
Ooh, can't wait to hear about those.
We'll dive into those in part 2 of our deep dive.
I think I need a minute to process everything we've learned already. This is a lot.
I hear you. We've only just scratched the surface of this whole tipping point world. It's funny, we ended part 1 talking about engineering change.
Right?
Because Gladwell brings up this example of how change can almost get frozen.
Oh, really? What is it?
He uses the Holocaust.
Oh, wow.
Remember how we talked about TV bringing the Holocaust to light?
Yeah.
Well, for decades after the war, people didn't really talk about it.
Even the survivors.
Even them, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
There's this unspoken agreement to keep it buried.
I can't even imagine. I mean, it's such a central part of history now.
Right. And Gladwell says that silence actually allowed for denial and distortion to take root.
Makes you wonder if other things are being silenced right now.
Oh, absolutely. But this overstory, thankfully, it started to shift in the 70s.
What happened in the 70s?
A few things came together. The miniseries Holocaust education programs,
Yep.
and more survivors started sharing their stories.
It's crazy how powerful stories can be.
It's true, yeah. They can break down even the most ingrained overstories.
For sure. It makes you think about what other stories need to be told.
It makes you think, yeah. And you know what else is interesting? This thing called preference falsification.
Preference falsification. Okay,
Yeah,
that sounds intense. What is that?
Think of it like going along with the crowd even if you disagree.
Oh, I do that all the time.
You do.
No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I get it. Like being afraid to speak your mind.
Right, exactly. Like you're worried about the consequences of being different.
Okay, yeah. So like peer pressure, but like on a societal level.
Right. And Gladwell says it plays a huge role in shaping what's acceptable in society. He uses the Soviet Union as an example.
Oh, yeah. Under a totalitarian regime, speaking out can get you in big trouble.
Of course. But it happens in more subtle ways, too, even in democracies. Gladwell even suggests it played a role in the opposition to same-sex marriage.
You mean people were afraid to support it even if they believed in it?
That's what he argues, yeah. And this overstory, this narrative against same-sex marriage,
Right.
it started shifting in the late 90s and early 2000s.
What caused that shift?
Well, a lot of things.
That-
The visibility of LGBTQ plus folks in the media,
Okay.
activists working hard, changing demographics, all those things combined.
So it wasn't just one tipping point.
More like a bunch of little dominoes falling.
And it reminds me of how the Soviet Union collapsed, like seemingly out of nowhere.
Gladwell connects that to the same-sex marriage movement, how both seemed so solid, and then suddenly, boom.
It makes you wonder what else in our world is closer to a tipping point than we realize.
Totally. And that brings us to the final section of the book, the opioid crisis.
Oh, yeah. That's hit so many communities hard.
It really has. And Gladwell takes us way back, tracing opioid use back to the late 1800s.
The 1800s.
Yeah, opium was widely available back then.
Wow, I had no idea.
And then there's Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Didn't he, like, demonize drug use?
He did. He was instrumental in criminalizing addiction.
Interesting.
And that really cemented a strong overstory against drugs in America.
So this overstory was already in place when OxyContin came along.
Exactly. And Gladwell argues that overstory, that fear of drugs, made it hard to have an honest conversation about opioids, the risks and benefits.
Okay, yeah. And then in the 90s, enter OxyContin.
Right, the drug that's often blamed for the crisis.
How did that happen?
Well, Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, they really aggressively marketed it to doctors.
What do you mean aggressively?
They downplayed the addiction risks
Oh, wow.
and promoted it for all kinds of pain.
So they were basically trying to create a tipping point, get everyone prescribing it.
It was like the magic third, but with the doctors instead of women and corporations.
Right. And it wasn't just about the number of doctors, it was about the type of doctors.
Exactly. They targeted these super spreader doctors, the ones who were already prescribing opioids a lot.
It's starting to feel less like a health crisis and more like a calculated scheme.
Yeah. And it hits on this idea of group proportions again.
How so?
The crisis hits certain communities harder, like rural areas.
Why rural areas specifically?
They often have fewer resources to deal with addiction, like treatment centers and stuff.
Oh, right.
So you've got this addictive drug
Yeah.
being pushed by a company targeting doctors who overprescribe.
And it's all happening in communities that can't handle it.
It's a recipe for disaster, you know?
Mhm.
And Gladwell argues that all of that together created the tipping point for the epidemic.
Man, this is heavy stuff. We've gone from communities shaping our beliefs
Right.
to those super spreaders to, like, the ethics of all this. What's the takeaway from all this?
Gladwell reminds us that epidemics, social or viral, they're more predictable than we think.
So we're not just helpless,
Not exactly. There are patterns, rules we can learn.
so we can, like, fight back?
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's where the responsibility comes in, you know?
Yeah.
We have to understand how this all works to protect ourselves and to make the world better.
That makes sense. But knowing all this, what can we actually do?
That's a great question, and that's where we'll pick up in part 3. We'll look at actions we can take, real-world tipping points, and how we can be more conscious about shaping the forces around us.
Man, this deep dive into Revenge of the Tipping Point has been a wild ride.
It really has.
From how communities shape us to the super spreaders
Yeah.
to the ethics of it all, it's a lot.
That's a lot to unpack.
But the big question for me is, what do we do with all this knowledge?
That's the question, right? And Gladwell really pushes us to think about that.
Yeah.
Remember that whole thing with Purdue Pharma targeting those super spreader doctors?
Yeah, that was chilling.
It really shows the ethical side of using this tipping point knowledge, you know?
Absolutely. Gladwell doesn't give us easy answers.
No, he doesn't.
But he does give some interesting examples of what he calls positive social engineering.
You're like that Lawrence Tract housing project in Palo Alto.
Oh, yeah. That was a complicated one.
It was. But it shows how important it is to understand group proportions.
Right. Gladwell says white flight often happens when a minority group reaches a certain percentage.
Exactly. And in that case, they wanted to keep the black population below that tipping point.
To try and stop white families from leaving.
That was the idea, yeah. It's definitely controversial.
Yeah, for sure.
But it shows how knowing about tipping points can be used to try and make a community more integrated.
And then there's Harvard and how they use legacy admissions and recruiting athletes to keep certain group proportions.
Yeah. Gladwell points out that those practices, even if they seem neutral, actually keep inequalities going.
It's kind of scary to think about how many systems are designed to keep the powerful in power.
It makes you think. So then the question is, how can we use this knowledge to make things more fair?
How do we tip the scales in the right direction? Where do we even start?
Gladwell says we need to be more aware of the overstories we're creating.
Oh,
The messages those overstories are sending.
Okay. What kind of overstory should we be creating?
He talks about the power of media, like how shows like Will and Grace help change the narrative around same-sex marriage.
So, by sharing more inclusive stories, we can create a more inclusive world.
That's the idea. And this goes beyond just the media.
Okay.
We all play a part in shaping the overstories of our communities, you know.
What do you mean?
We can challenge stereotypes, speak out against injustice, and try to be more understanding.
It's about promoting empathy, right?
Exactly. These might seem like small actions, but they can have a big impact.
It makes me think about how divided everything feels these days, especially in politics.
Oh, totally.
It's like we're living in different overstories, can't even agree on basic facts.
Gladwell doesn't talk about this directly. But
Okay.
it makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
This polarization shows how dangerous those echo chambers and filter bubbles online can be,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
where we only see stuff that confirms what we already believe,
Yeah.
that makes it hard to see those tipping points.
And that just feeds the division, doesn't it?
It creates a vicious cycle. But remember what Gladwell showed us. Even small acts of courage can make a huge difference.
Okay.
They can spark bigger changes. The important thing is to not give up.
So what can we do as individuals with all of this? Like, practically speaking.
Well, I think it starts with awareness. We need to be more critical of the information we're taking in,
Okay.
be more aware of our own biases,
Yeah,
and be more willing to talk to people who have different views than our own.
that's tough these days.
It is. It's easy to get caught up in the negativity online.
Oh, yeah.
But maybe the answer is to focus on more positive stories, the good things happening.
It's about creating those new overstories, right?
Exactly. And this comes back to Gladwell's point about stories.
Yeah.
If we want a more just world, we need to tell stories that reflect that.
Stories that inspire us, right?
Yes, stories that remind us we're all connected.
Wow, this deep dive into Revenge of the Tipping Point has been eye-opening, to say the least.
It's a powerful book.
It makes us look at the world in a whole new way.
It shows how our communities shape us,
Right.
the potential for things to be manipulated, and the responsibility we all have to understand and shape the forces around us.
We hope this deep dive got you thinking about some new ideas.
Absolutely.
And remember, we all have the power to shape the world, so let's use that power wisely.
Here's to a more just and hopeful future.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.